Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Hoarding Disorder, Situations and Solutions for Property Managers. We really have an all-star panel for this compelling topic, and we're sure you'll find the presentations and discussion highly informative. My name is James Campbell, and I'm the Senior Manager of Industry Relations with NAA. I want to welcome all of our members in attendance. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping points. First, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted to our website and YouTube channel next week. You may then share this presentation with those colleagues and friends who are unable to attend at present. Second, we have a lot of time at the end of today's presentation for live questions and answers, but you may also type your questions into the Q&A or chat boxes on your screen at any time during our presentation, and we will share them with our presenters as soon as we are able. Third, a brief disclaimer that the information provided in this presentation does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice. Instead, all information provided is for general informational purposes only. Moreover, all situations discussed within any case studies to follow are for discussion purposes only. Facts and circumstances have been altered to preserve client anonymity. Now, I am very pleased to introduce you to today's host, Wendy Dorchester. Wendy oversees a portfolio of communities and departments as the Vice President of Operations and Corporate Support for Hawthorne Residential Partners. Her 30-year career focuses on quality leadership and increasing the use of technology. With NAA, Wendy served as the past Operations Committee Chairwoman, a Diversity Leadership Program mentor, and sits on the DE&I and Education Advisory Boards. She also holds a BS degree from the University of Maine. Wendy?
Thank you, James, and greetings to all of our audience. I'm so excited to be here today. I want to give you a little bit of background on how this webinar came about. Having been in the industry and also supporting a lot of field personnel being boots on the ground, as we say, we've seen hoarding come into our apartment communities. A couple of years ago, I had a brand new community. It was less than a year old, and we had an apartment home that was basically decimated. It had to be taken down to the studs, all of the appliances removed, drywall, due to potentially someone that had hoarding disorder. And it was a brand new apartment home. It had only been constructed about 9 months prior. And so this led me to be thinking about, how are we helping folks with potential hoarding disorder? What are we doing in the multifamily industry? Do we even understand what hoarding disorder is? And so in talking with NAA, we decided to come up with a webinar to give some education to our membership. I am so pleased that we really do have an all-star expert panel today. It is incredible. So I'm pleased to introduce them and also serve as your moderator for the Q&A session that will follow. Representing the service side of one of the nation's most prominent spokespeople, Corey Chalmers is president and founder of SteriClean, Crime Scene SteriClean, and Hoarders.com. He contributes 27 years of hoarding remediation experience. Corey is also a former paramedic and a captain with the Garden Grove Fire Department. As a featured expert, Corey appeared on 84 episodes of A&E's Hoarders, including the pilot. He is also a keynote speaker at conferences, conventions, and training seminars. Representing the clinical side as one of the country's leading authorities is Dr. Randy Frost. He's Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Smith College. He's published over 200 scientific articles on hoarding disorder. Dr. Frost has co-authored several best-selling books on this topic, and his research has been featured on many news networks, including NPR, NBC, CBS, and ABC. Dr. Frost has given numerous lectures on hoarding disorder in the US and internationally. And representing the legal side, we have Christopher Ligotti. He's an attorney specializing in fair housing issues relating to disability discrimination. He's published research on related topics in multiple law reviews, including on hoarding. Chris serves as a trial attorney with the federal government and has held academic positions with DePaul College of Law and New England Law. He holds a JD summa cum laude from New England Law and a BA from George Washington University. I want to welcome our distinguished panelists. So now I'd like to ask Corey to help us set the scene with situations that property managers typically encounter with hoarding. Corey, take it away.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you great.
All right, perfect. So yeah, glad you guys could make it. This is a really important topic. We get a lot of calls from apartment communities and managers dealing with hoarders in their complex. So one of the first things I want to go over is, how do you even tell? Let's say it's a case you don't even know yet. How can you tell there's a hoarder in your communities? So one of the things you can look for is starting in your parking lot. Sometimes you'll see cars like this that are cluttered and very full of stuff. And a good sign that the apartment also looks this way is when you see a full car. Because I guarantee if you see a hoarded car, there's no way that their apartment is not similar. So just something to look for before we even start looking at the apartment is scan your parking lot, and maybe you know whose car it is. That's a pretty good sign that something's going on inside of the unit as well. Another sign you can look for is excess deliveries. You know, a lot of our hoarding clients, to fill a void in their life, they're actively acquiring, and one of the quick ways they can do that is ordering things online or on Home Shopping Network through the TV. And so you'll see these packages come quite often and stack up on their front porches from UPS, FedEx, Amazon, USPS, you name it. Look for these packages being delivered in excess over a normal unit. Something else to look for on your porches and rear patios, if you have those, is just overflow. You know, sometimes the apartment gets so full or the unit gets so full that they run out of space and they'll start storing things on the exterior as well. And you can typically tell these things aren't being used very often because they'll often sit there for so long that they actually become dilapidated by the weather. So just look for those types of signs. Another big clue is they won't let anyone in the apartment. So you may have some scheduled maintenance that you need to get in for, or some kind of inspection, and they refuse to let you in, or they make a lot of excuses and just keep delaying it. You'll see when they have their own friends or family come over that they meet them outside of the front porch or in the parking lot. So look for that big clue. If no one is allowed in that unit, there's clearly something going on, and oftentimes that's hoarding. Another thing you can see is look at the windows of the unit. Sometimes you'll see visible clutter. Other times it won't be that obvious. You'll just see like the curtains or the blinds will be pushed against the window from the objects pushing on the curtains and blinds. Other times you'll just see units never have their curtains or blinds open. They are drawn shut 365 days a year, which can be a little odd. I'm not saying that's indicative of hoarding by itself, but it is odd that someone would never open their curtains or their blinds. So look at the windows as well. So those are just a few ways that you can look at some of your properties and even your parking lot for signs that you may have a hoarder living in your community. Most likely, if you are a manager, you have hoarders in your community because they can make up anywhere, depending on the study, from 2 to 7% of the population. So let's just use 5. You know, that's 1 out of 20 people that are suffering from hoarding. So if you have a complex with 100 people, you probably have about 5 hoarders in it. One of the things I like to talk to about management companies, because you are overseeing multi-tenant occupancies, is what kind of dangers hoarders bring to your community. Yes, people should be able to live however they want, but when you start affecting the livelihoods of your neighbors, that's a concern that you need to be aware of and you probably need to handle. Being a retired fire captain and a paramedic, you know, one of the things that we saw often as a side effect and a result of hoarding is fire. Unfortunately, these units are big fire dangers. The fire load or combustible materials inside of the units are vast. So once a fire starts, it is very hot and it's very hard for us to put out quickly, meaning it will probably spread to other units. And if it gets up into the common attic space, that's a wide open space over the top of the apartment communities. So you'll usually lose, you know, the entire structure. And even if it didn't burn, all the water damage from us trying to put the fire out causes significant damage to all the other units. So fire is a real threat. Here's some things to look for when you're inside of a unit, if you're lucky enough to get inside of one. Look for light bulbs, something people don't think about often, but a lot of times the lampshades will be off because they've either been damaged or because, like I said, curtains are drawn tight, blinds are always tight, so they need more light, so they'll take the lampshades off. When those light bulbs get too close to combustible materials, they just simply preheat them over and over until, one of these days that thing is going to light on fire, whatever that is, whether it's paperwork, a sofa, maybe some drapes hanging down next to the bed. So look for those exposed light bulbs. Overloaded circuits, like you see in the top middle photo there, sometimes there's only 1 or 2 outlets that are able to be even accessed. So they'll plug their entire livelihood into that 1 or 2 outlets, which can cause them to overload. In the upper right-hand picture, probably don't need to tell you this, but candles and hoarding are not a good mixture, especially if they're an open flame like this without the glass enclosure on it. All it takes is for something to, fall or maybe open a window and a door, and that candle is now blowing in a certain direction, and it can certainly light something on fire. Water heaters. A lot of people don't think about water heaters, but where is the flame on most water heaters? Right at the bottom. So as clutter and debris kind of get pushed out laterally in a hoard, all it takes, like in that lower left-hand picture there, is for the combustible materials to get close enough to that open flame, and a fire will start instantly. As we know, hoarders don't really want to ask for help when things break. They're too scared, too ashamed, too embarrassed, so they'll just slowly adapt. So when things like cooking ranges, ovens break, they will adapt by using these portable hot plates, and they'll set them right on all the combustible materials in their hoarded environment, which run the risk of preheating any of those combustible materials and catching on fire. Sometimes we see things like furnaces break. And again, they don't want to call you guys. They're scared, they're embarrassed. So they'll do things like you see in the lower right-hand picture. They'll leave all their burners on continuously to heat their residences during cold winter months, which obviously comes with the danger of anything falling or sliding down onto that open flame. And it would be very difficult to put that fire out once it started. Here's an example of a hoarding fire I was on, just to kind of give you an example of what we're having to deal with, what the hoarder themselves are having to deal with. Now, when this is completely full of smoke, you can't see the hand in front of your face. So you have no idea what's around you or above you. So just showing you, once the fire's out, this is what we were literally crawling through. It's extremely dangerous. And again, it burns very hot. So this stuff is not only dangerous because it's sitting above you and heavy, but now it's whatever's holding it up is burned and waterlogged, which puts that much more stress on the stuff that's holding it. And it is going to fall sooner or later. So what are the safety concerns in another way? Well, because of the perfect ecosystem that hoarders create, very happy roommates that you typically do not want. And those can include anything from rodents to insects. If you go to the next slide, you'll see some of those examples. Again, they have plenty of shelter. They have all the food they need, the water and the drinks they need. So they really don't have to leave the unit, but typically they do. And so you'll start getting complaints from neighbors about mice, rodents, spiders, cockroaches, you name it, kind of infiltrating all the neighboring units. And that's the first sign that you have a problem. We also have to think about the danger that the structure itself is under. Remember, this is a box, it's a container that is built to withstand so much weight. Typically, that's around 40 pounds per square foot. And when you have these hoarding environments, you're really exceeding that, especially if it's a heavy hoard of paperwork, books, clothing, things that are more dense, leaving no void spaces in the hoard. You're putting extreme stress on this structure. And so you'll see things out there where there's cracked floor joists, ceiling joists, things that show that the stress laterally and gravity is putting on your structure. In that left-hand picture, you can see mold. We go on a lot of cases where there's been a slow leak underneath all of the hoard and the stuff that you can't even see. And so once we start removing everything, because we can smell the mold and mildew, and we notice some severe mold infiltration. And if it's something like that severe that you're seeing, again, you're going to lose the whole unit. It's going to have to be completely rebuilt. In the right-hand upper corner there, on the right side, you see just, a ceiling collapse. We see that quite common. Again, there's no maintenance going on in these units. And as you know, any of your units, any home takes ongoing maintenance, and the hoard typically prevents that from happening. This is a good example of a home I was in. This isn't a fisheye lens or any special lens. This was a hoarders episode we were filming, and the camera guy called me and said, hey, you got to get over here. We're just getting here, and I'm a little concerned to even be in this house. So this can show what one floor can do to the floor below. So you'll see that beam there right in the middle. It's actually bowed down quite a bit. These blue lines show you where that structural support should be and where it actually is, because it's under so much stress from the hoarding behavior or the hoarding conditions above it. And this is something that we do not want to see, because this structure is about to collapse. Biohazards is another big one, and I'm sorry for those of you that just ate lunch or are thinking of eating lunch. This isn't the most appealing photo to be looking at right now, but it's true. Unfortunately, we find a lot of biohazards. It could be because the functioning plumbing, it's not functioning anymore, so they resort to using other means. A lot of them, because they don't throw things away, they stack things like diapers, feminine products, you name it. So that's one way that we go in and we find biohazards. When their plumbing breaks, they resort to other means. They're too afraid, too ashamed, too embarrassed to call for help. Next slide, we'll see another form of biohazard. You can't see it really, but if you look closely, and then the next slide will point it out to you, but this is the problem with this one. You can see some needles there. We see needles a lot in hoard. Doesn't mean it's a drug user. It could just be a diabetic patient. But if they're not throwing regular trash away and organizing things, do we really expect them to be putting their sharps in properly labeled sharps containers? Probably not. And so as you see these next couple pictures, this can really be a safety concern for anyone walking through the unit. If you don't know that they're there, we might be stepping on them and they could stick right through our shoes, right through our feet, and infect us with any number of bloodborne pathogens and communicable diseases. There's one more photo that we'll show you, I think, on the needles, or maybe two more. And this will really slow down the process of us cleaning as well. We can't just come in and make quick work of this. We have to be very careful, because the best thing we can do is wear puncture resistant gloves, not puncture proof, which means we can still get stuck. And so we will be moving very slowly to clean out this hoard. Here's a good example of when we moved a bed in an apartment. This is what was underneath and to the side of the bed. So every night they would do their injections and just drop them on the floor to the side of their bed. Again, this will greatly slow down the process, and it's something you're gonna need to think about if you're gonna have your maintenance workers or any of your staff go inside of these units. Think about these biohazards, think about the structural damage and things that you could possibly be facing.
Thank you so much, Corey. That was extremely helpful in letting us know, what can be involved in these hoarding situations. Now we're going to turn things over to Dr. Frost, and he's going to give us a clinical perspective on hoarding disorder. Dr. Frost?
Thank you, Wendy. So what is hoarding disorder? Why is it important that we ask this question? Well, on those slides we saw, the clutter and the squalor in a number of these units can come about from hoarding disorder. Maybe that's the most frequent disorder associated with it, but there are other sources of conditions like this, and it's important to distinguish those from hoarding disorder, because the way that we approach them can be vastly different, or may need to be vastly different. So I'm going to walk you through the DSM criteria for hoarding disorder. Hoarding disorder became a psychological or mental disorder in 2013 with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual's revision. And there are two critical defining features. The first is a persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions, regardless of their actual value. Now, it's worded this way because initially in the mental health field, it was believed that hoarding was a behavior associated with saving worthless and worn out things. But what we know from our research is that in hoarding behavior and hoarding disorder, people save virtually everything. We have cases where homes are filled with virtually all new items, with tags never removed, with things never out of boxes and so forth. So it's not so much the actual value of the possession that makes a difference to hoarding behavior. The second criteria here is that this behavior, this saving behavior, is due to a perceived need to save the items and distress associated with discarding them. Now, this is an important characteristic because some of the other reasons why clutter and squalor can develop like this are associated with conditions where things are saved not because of a perceived need to save them, but for other reasons. And I want to talk you through a little bit those perceived needs, because they're important to understand if you have a client with a hoarding problem, in order to communicate with them in an effective way. So the next slide describes a little bit about the motivations behind this perceived need to save things. And we divide these up really into four different kinds of motivations. The first is a loss motivated saving. Now here, that's quite interesting. The things that are perceived to be lost by throwing things out have to do with opportunities for the future. One of my early clients is a woman who said it quite eloquently. She said, my home is like a river. The possessions I have are like a river traveling through my home. And I just want to stop it long enough that I can take advantage of each of the opportunities presented by those things. And in some ways, I often think of this as a disorder of opportunity. All of us, as we grow and mature, learn that in order to take advantage of some opportunities, we have to give up others. But what if we never got to that point? What if we refused to give up any opportunity that presented itself to us? In the end, we'd be unable to take advantage of any opportunity, and those opportunities that did present themselves would become less important to us. The other kinds of losses we see here are losses of a perceived future. That is a perceived future self. So that if I'm saving boxes of things I've picked up on the road, thinking that I'm going to somehow repair lawnmowers and sell them, or I'm going to put things together in such a way that I can somehow sell them, get rid of them. I see my identity as some kind of future fix-it person. And it's all this future, this sort of idealized future that I create in my head. And now I save things for that future, but I never get to that place because my world is so dominated by all the things I'm collecting. And likewise, there's a loss of a sort of idealized past, or a sort of whitewashed past, that I save items that remind me of things in the past and maybe give me a sense of personal history. One of my recent clients said something about if I don't keep it, I'll lose the memory of it, and it's like it never happened. It's like that moment in my life is gone. So a number of the saving is due to that sense of loss. The second kind of motivation we see is a distress motivated saving behavior. And here the focus is on safety and comfort. Can't tell you how many people with this problem talk about feeling vulnerable and feeling as though if anyone touched any of their things, it was like a physical violation of their body almost. It's almost as though these possessions become part of their body, and removing them was like removing an arm or taking something away from their body. The third kind of motivation that we see is guilt motivated. Now here, the focus is on a fear of waste or a fear of harm. And this is one of the strongest predictors of the severity of hoarding behavior. The sense that I have to save this in order not to waste. We've had clients who saved cereal boxes with the idea that they're going to use the cereal box as stationery so they don't have to throw it away. Along with this, we see a sense of guilt associated with a fear of harming possessions. Now here, what we see among people with hoarding problems is a heightened level of anthropomorphizing of objects, that is, giving human characteristics to objects. So I don't want to throw away that yogurt container because it will feel uncomfortable when I throw it away. And so for that reason, I save it. And the final kind of motivation I describe is one of, I call it awe motivated. Now here, the saving behavior is motivated by a sense of beauty and aesthetics, that somehow people with hoarding disorder have a heightened sense of aesthetic sensitivity to the beauty of physical possessions. I think about it a little bit like the way kids, when they're young, look at a cardboard box and it just awes them. The shape, they can do so many things with it, and and so forth. And that kind of awe, that kind of appreciation for the physical characteristics of possessions is an important piece of the hoarding puzzle. Go on to the next slide. Now, there are several important characteristics or critical defining features that have to do not so much with the behaviors of the person, but with the consequences of the behaviors we've just talked about. And the first is accumulation of possessions that clutter active living areas of the home and substantially compromise their intended use. This is an outcome of the behaviors we talked about. Now, it's possible to get this diagnosis even if there is no accumulation of clutter, if the living areas are uncluttered because of interventions of third parties, like family members or cleaners or other authorities. So we can't simply say a person no longer has a hoarding disorder if someone comes in and cleans up their home, because the behaviors haven't changed. If the behaviors don't change, that accumulation of possessions will return. And so that's why this diagnostic criteria is included. And the next slide. The final inclusion criteria here is that this behavior and the accumulation of clutter causes clinically significant distress or impairment in some important area of function, social, occupational, or other important areas, including maintaining a safe environment for self and others. And again, this is a consequence of the other three criteria. Next slide. Now, there are two criteria that have to do with when we see these behaviors, when we see this clutter, what happens if it's due to some other kind of problem? And so we would not give the diagnosis of hoarding disorder if the behavior is attributable to another medical condition. There are a couple of medical conditions where we see intense collecting and clutter and sometimes squalor. Certain kinds of brain injuries and certain kinds of cerebrovascular disease, we see this. So one question to ask when you have a case like this: has the person experienced some kind of brain injury? Are they experiencing some sort of cardiovascular problem in order to distinguish it from hoarding disorder? And the difference here, if we can make that distinction, these kinds of problems, of brain injury, cerebrovascular disease, are much easier to intervene because you don't have the nature of this attachment to the possession in the same way that we do with hoarding disorder. And the final exclusion criteria is that this is not better accounted for by another DSM-5 disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, major depression, psychotic disorders, dementia, so forth. A good example, OCD, it seems counterintuitive, but people who have a contamination fear, contamination phobia, will usually engage in some kind of cleaning ritual in order to accommodate, in order to somehow put the brakes on this fear. However, sometimes we see this get so far out of hand that the person gives up on their compulsion. They still have the contamination fear, but they no longer engage in the cleaning behavior. And so what happens is their home fills up with things that they don't want to keep, and they don't have any attachment to those objects. And so, but they can't touch them because in touching them, they would become contaminated. And so these kinds of cases, in contrast to hoarding disorder, are much easier to intervene because they're perfectly fine with someone else coming in and cleaning it up. Then the treatment focus is much different on the OCD. Major depression, we often see people with major depression who don't have the motivation to clean up. And so they just let things drop on the floor and stay there. And so the clutter builds up. And again, they're not really interested in saving the items. Their beliefs are that it's not a perceived need to save the item. It's just a problem with motivation. Psychotic disorders and dementia are other disorders where we sometimes see this behavior. But here the focus really is on cognitive disorientation or disorganization that is so extreme that they can't manage the possessions coming into their home. And finally, autism spectrum disorder, we see hoarding behavior, but here the behavior, the accumulation of items is much different than it is in hoarding disorder. It's typically focused on a single theme, rather than in hoarding disorder, the saving behavior is all over the map. It's virtually everything. Next slide, please. There are two diagnostic specifiers, and these are also quite important to understand from the standpoint of how we intervene. The first is whether or not this disorder is associated with excessive acquisition of possessions. And what we know from our research is that 90 to 95% of people with hoarding disorder acquire excessively. So if we clean out an apartment, if we help the person clean out the apartment and the apartment is fine, and we haven't dealt with the acquisition problem, it's going to come back in relatively short order. And so that's an important piece of the puzzle to keep in mind. And then finally, the question of insight tells us a lot about how hard or easy this is going to be to intervene. Good or fair insight, people who understand the nature of the problem and understand that this is really something they need to do something about. People with poor insight who may be sort of ambivalent, sometimes they recognize it, sometimes not. Or people with absent insight, people who may be in part delusional about this. Now, the absent insight part is quite interesting because we don't know for sure whether these people have no recognition that this is a problem or they're simply being defensive. Because most people with this disorder have gone decades being criticized by family, friends, and so forth. And the easiest way for them to deal with that criticism is to deny the problem, not let anybody into the apartment, not let anybody see it, and so forth. And so that's a problem, not so much with insight, but with engagement. How do we engage with these people to get them to cooperate in putting together some kind of intervention? Next slide, please. So one of the major distinctions I think that's important from the standpoint of understanding an apartment, especially some of the apartments that Corey showed us, is the distinction between squalor and hoarding. These are two separate problems. Now, in hoarding disorder, we do see some evidence of squalor, but for the most part, it's with a relatively small number of people who have hoarding disorder. Squalor by itself does exist in many cases, squalor without hoarding. And the difference here, there are a couple of some major differences where you can kind of tell whether this is squalor and hoarding. The intervention is a little bit different too, because in squalor, it's usually a little bit easier for them to part with possessions. So for squalor is more likely associated with purposeless accumulation. Hoarding, people accumulate things with purpose. It might not make a lot of sense to us, but they do have a purpose for collecting. But in squalor, it's more purposeless. In squalor, it's easier for them to part with the objects than it is with hoarding disorder. Squalor also, the condition of the home tends to be worse. More often, it's rubbish. More often, there is self-neglect. So you can tell by the way they dress, by the smell around them, if there's a personal body odor and so forth. More often with squalor, the insight is poor. The onset is often sudden in squalor, and that's somehow related to some of the diagnostic issues that we see. In squalor, for instance, there's a high comorbidity with dementia. So this squalor may develop in the early stages of a growing dementia or Alzheimer's in some patients. Now, we also see squalor in animal hoarding cases, that is people who collect animals. And here, yeah, it may be a form of hoarding disorder, but it's a really a pretty distinct form of hoarding disorder where with a large number of animals, it's easy for a place to turn squalid quickly and get out of control quickly. Next slide, please. So in treatment, go back one. In treatment, we focus on three things. We have to focus on acquisition because, as I said, if we deal with the condition of the property, okay, and not with the acquisition, the problem is going to come back. So that's an important piece. And in treatment, we focus quite a bit on that. We focus on the saving behavior. Now here, what I mean is in treatment, in psychological treatment for this, what we focus on are those motives and try to disentangle them and get them to change the nature of their attachments to objects. Because unless we get them to change the nature of their attachments to objects, that behavior is not going to change. And so even if their house is cleared out, they're likely to start collecting again. And the third feature we focus on is disorganization, because that's in part what contributes to the dramatic overflow of objects, that they can't figure out a way of organizing. Now, most people with hoarding disorder tend to organize their world visually and spatially. So if they have an electricity bill, it may go on top of the pile, over a little bit to the left. And a month later, when they're looking for it, they will have to remember where it is in that pile. So their organization, maybe maybe it is a form of organization, but it's not a very effective one. It's visual and spatial. They have a three-dimensional map in their head of what's in that pile. And if you ask, they might say, well, that bill is over to the left and about a foot down now. Now, the rest of us organize our worlds, for the most part, categorically. So we put an item like a bill into a bigger category of utility bills, for instance. And then when we want to find the individual unit, we go to that particular label and then look for the individual member. But if for people with hoarding disorder, they don't do that. So the focus in treatment is on these three things: preventing acquisition, reducing saving behavior, and increasing organizational behavior. And then the final slide, just some resources. The International OCD Foundation has a hoarding resource network. They run a virtual hoarding conference. In fact, it's next weekend. If you're interested, go to iocdf.org and look at what the program, the virtual hoarding conference. They also have an in-person conference in July of this year in Seattle. And my email is there if any of you have questions. Thank you.
Dr. Frost, I just can't thank you enough. Just fascinating to learn the differences and all of the insight that you have. We're going to turn next to Christopher Ligotti, but I also want to let the audience know that Corey is going to be back after Chris to talk about some solutions and also show you some before and after photos of some hoarding cases in which he's helped clean them up and how terrific they look at the end. I also want to mention, Chris, that there was a question that came over in the chat that I believe you're going to address, but I'm going to go ahead and bring it up now just so you can be thinking about it during your presentation. So Cynthia Ann asked, we cannot actually ask a resident if they have a medical condition due to HIPAA and fair housing, correct? So I know that you're going to address that in your presentation, but I'm going to turn it over to you so that you can help us with your perspective on legal issues, implications, and consequences when encountering potential hoarding disorder among residents. So go ahead, Chris, and let us have your insights.
Yep, thank you, Wendy. And thanks to the NAA for having us here today. It's been a great presentation so far, and it's been really helpful to hear from Corey and Dr. Frost. So as Wendy said, I'm here to talk about the legal perspective on hoarding, and we are going to get to that question that came from the audience and a kind of fair housing perspective on this. But first, I want to talk about some of the legal problems that hoarding can cause. So there are a number of legal issues that can be implicated by hoarding behavior, or even if it doesn't meet the technical definition of hoarding disorder, by squalor, whether it be caused by OCD or any other type of disorder or situation. There are health and safety consequences. Of course, the safety of the person who's engaging in this behavior. Medical studies have shown that hoarding conditions can lead to the exacerbation of conditions such as asthma, other medical conditions. Hoarding can have a very negative impact on those. And then besides the person themselves, the safety of the public. In a multifamily building, the ability of first responders to gain unobstructed access to, if the fire starts in the hoarder's apartment, to gain access to that person, to gain access to part of the fire, to gain access to the hoarder if there's a fire emergency in a different part of the building. This can also, hoarding behavior can lead to insect or rodent infestations, which can of course affect the entire building, as Corey discussed. And there are local laws that apply here, municipal codes such as fire and safety codes. There's the common law cause of action regarding private or public nuisances. So those can lead to legal action when a hoarding behavior or any other behavior is creating a noxious condition that affects someone else's property. And of course, in the multifamily situation, you've got lease violations, and you've got conditions of the lease that the tenant could violate and put themselves, their possessions and their own housing at risk by engaging in that kind of behavior. So let's go to the next slide. Legal consequences of hoarding. Homeowners, fines can be imposed by a municipality, properties can be condemned. For renters, fines can be imposed by the housing provider, by a landlord. Landlords can be fined by the municipality if they have properties that are not up to code or are violating code. And of course, for the tenants, eviction is a real possibility as well. I've even read about cases where child welfare services have had to intervene and remove children from a situation where the living situation was simply not safe for them. And of course, there's criminal and civil liability potentials. As a lawyer, of course, I'm going to talk about those for if there's fire or anything that causes damage to a tenant or another person, that can lead to civil liability, wrongful death, negligence. And that could be on the head of the tenant, or it could be on the head of the housing provider to the extent that they knew about the problem and didn't take action. So those are some things to keep in mind. This is a serious situation. So let's move along to the next slide. And I expect, coming at it as many of you are as property managers or owners, that those are the kind of problems that you are thinking about, the potential liability, the costs and effort associated with going through with evicting such tenants and then still having to clean the area. So, but there also are some Fair Housing Act implications, some disability rights implications you should be aware of. As Dr. Frost said, hoarding disorder is a medical condition. It's likely that this would qualify as a disability under the Fair Housing Act, and therefore it could be subject to reasonable accommodation requests. Most of you are probably familiar with that term. I'm not going to go into the whole 20 minutes on what a reasonable accommodation request is and how to analyze them. But in layman's terms, it's granting an exception to a rule or policy to give to meet the needs of a person with a disability. So to the next slide. So when I'm talking about a reasonable accommodation for a person who may be suffering from hoarding disorder, who may be suffering from, let's say, OCD, and it's creating these kind of squalor conditions, the accommodation is not to leave the hoarding in place or to allow them to have an unsafe condition in the apartment. It cannot be excused and accepted as the basis of a reasonable accommodation request. I want to make that, obviously very clear. However, the way we see this come up usually is a tenant seeking to defend or delay an eviction, or, generally it could be used for fines or any kind of adverse action, lease non-renewal, of course, too, can be the subject of a reasonable accommodation request to give the tenant more time to eliminate the lease violation. And to the person in the audience who asked the question, yes, you don't want to see a whole potential hoarding situation and say, do you have hoarding disorder? This is something the tenant needs to bring to your attention when such adverse action is discussed or threatened. So let's go on to the next slide. So, and here we get into something Dr. Frost said as well, that, whether the person perceives that they have a problem the person needs to perceive that to make a reasonable accommodation claim. It's a claim based on the fact that the person requesting it is one with a disability. And there has been case law where a court has thrown out a case brought by, I think, the legal aid or people representing someone who is engaging in this type of behavior, because basically under testimony, she said, I don't see any problem with it. I mean, I'll clean up because you want me to not get evicted, but I don't have a disability. Well, that's not gonna suffice for a reasonable accommodation. So they have to admit that there's a kind of problem, and this usually is going to be predicated upon your either taking such an adverse action, as I talked about during the last slide, or maybe you make a routine maintenance request to have someone come into the apartment. Maybe you're upgrading something. As Corey said, apartments aren't going to stay in pristine condition or even functional if maintenance isn't done. So you make that request under the lease and under local law, and they won't let you in. And it turns out it's a hoarding situation. You explain to them, you've got to let us in to do this. It's a violation of the lease that can have such and such consequences. And then they might come to you with this kind of request. So where I typically see this is asking for more time to complete a cleanup based on a doctor, social worker, or therapist's letter. And that's likely going to be considered reasonable under the circumstances. We're going to go through some things that courts have found unreasonable in those type of requests. But generally speaking, the first time someone comes to you for that, and if they're only asking for, let's say, a few weeks, that's generally going to be found to be reasonable. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a quote from something I wrote about the reasonableness. Is this request for an accommodation actually reasonable? And as it says in somewhat less concise language, it's usually going to be reasonable the first time it's requested. When it can be found to be unreasonable is often when you have someone who cleans up, it gets bad again, is a kind of repeat offender, or there's recidivism. Or when it's someone who asks, let's say, for a month, and then they have to go back and ask for more time. Maybe it's reasonable the second time, maybe they provide some more details. But if this continues, the courts are going to eventually find that it's unreasonable. There's nothing that categorically denies subsequent reasonable accommodation requests, but courts are going to look at those repeated requests as evidence that the accommodation previously requested was not effective. So what is new about this second accommodation request that could actually increase its effectiveness? So, if I were advising someone making those kind of requests, or an attorney helping a tenant with this situation, what kind of further detail are you going to put in that request? The best of those, I think, would talk about not just the efforts of the attorney and the client, but medical or hoarding professionals. You've heard from a couple already, and would explain to the property manager how these are going to be used in rectifying the situation. Now, on the medical professionals, you're not going to be able to dive too deep into exactly what's, the details of treatment or the details of what's being discussed there, because you're right, there are privacy and HIPAA concerns there. But the takeaway I think you want to get from this is that subsequent requests should have subsequent information. The request that was reasonable the first time may not be reasonable a second time if the first time it wasn't effective. And I think, as Dr. Frost said, if you don't deal with the underlying, let's say it's actual hoarding disorder, if you don't deal with the underlying accumulation issue, you may not, you may have recidivism occur. So let's go on to the next slide. So this is just a very brief reminder. I'm sure you've gotten this training before, but what is a reasonable accommodation request? It doesn't need to use the term reasonable accommodation. That's the main takeaway. What it is asking for an exception to a rule or more time to comply with a lease provision, something like that, and tying that to a medical condition. So for instance, if you confront a tenant about the condition of their apartment, and the tenant says, I'll get it done. I need a couple weeks. My brother's going to come into town. He's going to help me clean this up. Well, that's a request. You can grant that. That's fine. But it's legally, it's not a reasonable accommodation request. It's not implicating disability rights there, because it's not saying anything about a medical condition. Second example down there, same thing. You talk to a tenant, let's say, you're not able to get in their building to do maintenance. and you need to, and they say, okay, I'll get it done. I need a couple weeks. I'm working with my therapist about this problem. We're setting goals for how I'm gonna get this cleaned up. That probably would suffice as a reasonable accommodation request. It doesn't mention a diagnosis. It doesn't mention disability, but it mentions a mental health provider and suggests that there's a mental health condition going on there. Now, of course, that's not just the tenant saying that to you is not likely sufficient information. You would be within your rights to ask for a letter from the tenant, from the therapist, explaining the need for extra time and confirming that the person has a health condition that substantially limits a major life activity. So that's just a brief reminder of, what a reasonable accommodation request is. It's my strong recommendation that you keep a log of those in writing, whether for hoarding or anything else, just so that you have records. Some published cases in the past couple of years on hoarding. We had one case involving a housing authority, Falmouth Housing Corporation versus Flynn. Now, this person wanted more time to clean up their apartment before an eviction took place. The court kind of put an end to this saga because the housing provider showed evidence that eviction had already been discussed and first proposed 5 years ago. And the housing provider only started to go through the eviction process once the tenant projected help from 2 agencies and 3 individuals, including some that the housing provider hired themselves, and the tenant refused offers of therapy. So there you see the court. I'm not saying those are requirements you definitely don't need to spend 5 years dealing with it, but those are some things the court found significant in that case. E&V Acquisition versus Margaret H., I think, is an interesting case from New York. There, the tenant was granted an additional 6 months until eviction for nuisance to demonstrate she could keep the home in sanitary condition. 6 months seems long to me, as it probably does to most of you. Here, a very interesting part of it that I think influenced the court was that this person was a tenant in a multifamily, I believe, building, but they somehow have a life estate in the apartment. So they had a greater occupancy right than most tenants usually would have. And so I think, while it wasn't expressly said, that could be something that influenced the court's decision here. Finally, you'll probably like this last case a little more. Westfield Senior Citizens Housing Corp versus Lytel. The court held that a tenant's request for an indefinite time to complete cleaning that's not a request. There has to be a time frame on it. You can't say, I'll get it done eventually, just don't take any action against me. Once again, here, some support, what I would think of as supporting factors that aren't required, but maybe help the court come to this decision, is that the tenant had rejected the housing provider's outreach efforts. The problem had once again been longstanding. I don't think it was 5 years here. And the housing provider was getting potential fines from the government for the condition of the property. So those are 3 cases that I just plucked from the past couple years, just to see how courts are dealing with these. As a housing provider, you can tell that hoarding is causing a lot of problems, both for the tenant and for you guys as well. So when you're dealing with this situation, I know every lawyer that presents to you says this, but I think we've already said it today. It's advisable to get legal advice, both on the action to take against the tenant and if the tenant makes a reasonable accommodation request. Something that always gets asked is, what are the hard and fast rules for when we need to accept or deny such an accommodation? The courts say it's incredibly fact specific. So, so you do want someone who has knowledge of the case law, knowledge of the jurisdiction, to be able to chime in on that. You should know that there are some local resources that you might want to look into. In the past 10 years or so, maybe 15 to 20 is a better period, but government or public-private task forces have been established in some municipalities to deal with hoarding issues. And I'll talk more about those on the next slide, but it's worth looking into those. We can go back to the previous one for just a sec. It's worth looking into those as a housing provider, just because it's not your responsibility to present these to the tenant or the tenant's attorney. But if you saw some of the things in those previous cases, courts find it significant enough to mention when the housing provider actually seems like they're trying to help the tenant. So, you know, in my experience of arguing before different courts or adjudicators, a show of compassion goes a long way. And so you do want to keep that in mind. And those can be helpful in resolving, those kind of task forces can be helpful in resolving some of these situations. So let's go on to the next. I'll just give you some more detail about those. Last time I checked, I think there were about 75 of these nationwide, most major metropolitan areas. Though to be honest, I focus most on the coasts and the upper Midwest. Usually these will be organized by the city or county. Each will be different, just like the landlord-tenant laws in your state are different. They usually have representatives from medical community, social workers, law or code enforcement, and relevant local government agencies. And they try to offer to connect hoarders with therapy or social worker services to provide some of that service that could get at the root of the problem, rather than just the cleanup aspect of it, although they can also help with cleanup services. So the idea of many of those task forces to identify hoarding problems, you know, just Google to see if there are any in your jurisdiction and what kind of help they can provide.
Thank you, Chris.
So here, you know, I can't give legal advice, but I'm available to direct you to resources if you want to contact me. And of course, there's a paper that you can download for free from that link as well. Thank you.
Amazing. And we'll be sharing those resources as well. And folks, we're running a little bit behind, but a couple of the questions that have come up is, when do you actually intervene? First violation or after the third and final violation? How do you intervene with family, communities, and organizations? The panelists are welcome to answer these in the Q&A at the bottom of their Zoom if they like, and hopefully at the end we'll have time for some live answers. But I want to get to Corey because he's going to give us some action items to do in order to help with these hoarding situations, and he's going to race through this. And I thank you all very much for your patience. It's been incredibly informative. So I'm going to turn it back over to Corey now.
Sure, thank you. Now we're going to talk about services, you know, and what to do when you find out that you have a hoarder in your community. So go ahead to the first slide. So once discovered, you know, now what? What do you do? So one, you need to determine, is your tenant willing to accept help? That's the first step, because if they're willing, great. We can make a plan. We can help them. Can they clean it on their own? You know, are you asking kind of the impossible of them? Are there extreme dangers in there that they shouldn't even be in there? You don't have the benefit of being able to call like code enforcement, where in a single family home, they can come out and inspect it. So you may not even know these things, but you may realize it's not safe enough for them to be in on their own. Psychologically, they may not be able to handle this on their own. So there's some factors there that we don't really know how to answer that question until you know more about your tenant. Will you give them a time to cure notice? That's what most people do. You know, you have 30 days, here's some resources. Will you evict them? These are all the things that you need to really figure out and get answered by your legal counsel's best advice, because everything is going to vary depending on your lease and depending on city, county, and state laws that are basically different from place to place. So always start with your legal counsel, because you can really get into trouble with this if you don't do this the right way. Next slide. So where should help start? That's something that is asked all the time. And I love the next couple slides because I think it puts it in a perspective that is very simple to understand. So go ahead. While alcoholism is something totally separate, go back real quick just so I can make this point. I like to use it because we don't walk into a bar, take a bottle from an alcoholic and say, you know, you're welcome, I just cured you. The alcohol is a symptom of something going on, and we have to think of hoarding the same way. While the clutter and the trash and everything in the apartment is the concern, and it certainly is the problem that you're faced with, if we only focus on taking that away, and you can go to the next slide now, we're not addressing the behavior, just like Dr. Frost talked about and Chris talked about. So what's going to happen, just like if we take a bottle from an alcoholic, we're taking the symptom away, the clutter from the hoarder, it's just going to come back. So we have to deal with changing the behavior, or you're going to keep dealing with this tenant over and over and over. They're going to comply, they'll clean it up, they'll fill it back up, you're going to get them in trouble again, they'll comply. So we really do want to make that extra effort to get them the help for the behavior change. And I'll talk about those steps at the end of this presentation. So failure is pretty much guaranteed. The recidivism rate of hoarding is in the upper 90 percentile if we just go in and clean the unit. So cleaning is not successful by itself. So to assure the best outcome, we must work on the actual disorder, not the symptom. Therapy, support, finding a new identity and purpose are things that we have to work with on every client in order to change this behavior and give them some sort of pathway moving forward that they have some passion about, that they're happy with, not just, you took everything away. It's just like if I go to your house, empty your house out, take away your career and say, man, don't you feel great? No, I'm scared to death now, to be honest. So what we want to do when we get involved is we want to restore functionality and safety. If you use these terms with your tenants that suffer from hoarding, these are non-threatening words. Just say, listen, tenant, Joe, Lisa, whatever, we really are concerned about a couple things. And all we really want to do is restore functionality and safety to your unit. We're not trying to make it a model home. We don't need it pristine. So those are non-threatening words. We're not calling them a hoarder. How do we do this? In a very simple plan, we keep all items that a normal functioning household should have. We're not going to go throw away your medications, your telephone, things that are in our own homes. We want to keep all items that are valuable. Clearly, we're not going in there and throwing away things that are heirlooms or things that, are of severe, or extreme value. That would be silly. We want to keep all sentimental items within reason, of course. We want to recover bills, statements, documents, photographs, but anything in excess of that, we really should be able to recycle, donate, or dispose of, keeping those important items in the home and better organized. Go ahead to the next slide. How do we do that? This isn't just about removing items from the apartment or the property. So how do we get them to let go? Because anyone can carry something outside of a home or a residence. So how do we get them to let go? That's the most difficult part. Next slide. If you take anything away from this today, this is key. If you don't build trust with your tenant that is suffering from hoarding behaviors, you are never going to get anywhere. And it can be difficult. A lot of the people that have hoarding behaviors have been through a lot of things in their past, a lot of traumas with, abandonment issues, even death. I mean, things that have triggered this hoarding behavior have really created havoc on them. And developing trust with people can be very difficult. That's why they're so isolated and reclusive a lot of times. But if you can do this, it will really help you make a lot of progress, and it'll help them listen to you when you come at them with suggestions. Next slide. Control is huge with people that suffer from hoarding. So what we do is we don't clean it when they're gone. We would never recommend having someone go away and we clean their apartment while they're gone. Instead, just like you see here, we sit that person down right where all the activity is. We're going to walk right past him. The first 10 bags that we throw away are going to be absolute nothing but clear trash, because I guarantee you they're going to stop and say, hey, wait, before that goes on the truck or the dumpster, I need to see it. So as they start building that trust with us that we're really making good decisions, the day gets easier. In the meantime, we're bringing stacks of stuff, just like you can see with this gentleman there. Even if we know that it's keep, or if we know that it's discard, we're keeping them involved in the process. So, hey, Ralph, what would you like us to do with this? I just want to make sure that we're making good decisions. So the communication during the cleanup day is key. If the person was gone and we cleaned that garage and they came back to an empty garage, they would panic. While they're sitting there all day, if we get a clean garage, they're going to know exactly how it got that way, and they felt more in control the whole time. This is only done through sorting. Sorting is critical. We're going to make different categories for different clients depending on their particular situation, their needs, but most likely it's going to have keep, donate, recycle, and discard. We can make some sell piles, but I'm not a big fan of that because that only encourages hanging on to things in the future. We'd really like to leave knowing that everything is out of there that they don't truly need to live. Donating. We love donating, especially the homes where you have someone that is actively purchasing things. Everything is still brand new. So we bring all that stuff back to our warehouse and sit on it until a charity, maybe the county calls and they had a apartment building burned down, and they literally, like in the upper left-hand corner, they will come and load up their trucks and take it to these families. It's like Christmas. If you can find a charity that really resonates with your resident, they're going to let go of a lot more stuff. I guarantee it. We use this as a tool all the time. It could be a vet and they want all their stuff to go to a vet charity. We can certainly do that. Go to battered women and children because they were battered. We can do that. Hoarders don't want to let go of things that cost them a lot of money or they put a lot of energy and time collecting. So the more that they know this stuff is going to go to a needy cause and a good use, the more likely they're going to let it go. Benefit to them, they get the tax write-off and the tax break. It really helps the community. And we're letting go of stuff, but they're feeling good about it. We can also inventory everything so that they can have full slips to show their accountants for the tax write-offs. Disposal, unfortunately, it's a necessary evil, but the things that are not of monetary value, they're not useful. We can't donate them. In some cases, it could be something like a cat hoarder and there's just ammonia levels attached to everything. There could be rodents running around in the property and there's soiled contents. We need to explain to that client that we simply cannot donate those items. Sometimes we'll even get the charity on the phone and say, look, there's an odor to this stuff. Will you take it? They'll say no, but sometimes you have to prove that the charities won't take this stuff. So in that case, we are going to need to dispose of stuff and we can make any arrangements to do that. So results that matter, when done correctly, you'll have a happy tenant and a happy landlord, and you're working on the behavior so that it doesn't fill right back up. These are all befores and afters of real properties that we've helped clean out. So just anything is possible. It's the way that you work with the client, and it's the way you explain things. It's the way you get them to let go that is key. And you can just scroll through these. These are just examples of before and afters. And
Amazing results.
A lot of these people were difficult in the beginning, and not really on board, but through the process, they accepted it. This last photo I love because when we told him we were going to do it before and after, he said, wait, I want to be in it. I'm so happy. I love this. So there's our hoarder client showing off his new home. Again, done the right way, we can truly make a difference in their lives. But it's critical. Once you make a clean house, you're not done yet. And this is where most people fail. We think the clutter's gone, the problem is solved, but it's not. If we can introduce these 4 mandatory things after the cleanup, we can reduce or actually turn around that recidivism rate completely as long as the hoarder continues down this path. We need to get him into therapy. They have to work on the underlying causes, all those symptoms and things that are causing the hoarding behavior. Dr. Frost talked about several of them. Depression, post-trauma, ADD, ADHD, OCD, there's a whole list of them. And that's what makes it so difficult. You're not going to send a hoarder to therapy and be cured within a week or 2. This is a long-term thing that they need to work through many layers of. Support. They need support. This is a big change for them. There might be no one in their family, no friends that really understand what they're going through. They just might not have any. So finding support for them that they can work through all of their emotions and their struggles during this process is really important. Professional organizers. Every time we go clean a house, we put a lot of things in boxes and storage bins. That's not really making the house functional and safe. So the final little knot tying a bow on top of this package is bringing in professional organizers to help unpack those boxes, help them with tools and systems. What do I do when I bring groceries in, or when I go shopping, or when the mail comes? How do I organize this? That might not be a forever thing, but organizers for at least a few visits to get them set up in the right way is critical. And then finally, we like to have cleaners set up to come in monthly or even bi-monthly. And they're not only doing the maintenance ongoing to help them keep it clean, but they have 2 emergency phone numbers to maybe a family member or to us, the cleaning company. And if they see any clutter coming back, they make a phone call so we can get involved again and cut it off before it ever becomes a problem. Those 4 things will stop hoarding and help them change the behavior moving forward. So you're not dealing with this client over and over. And this is just a good example. Another lady, we found her living like this on the left, buried in her own contents, working on her one little chair that she could sit on. After the cleanup, here she is with her grandson with a huge smile on her face. She's ready for this new life. She's embracing it. It was not a struggle to get through this process. So done the right way, you can absolutely help your tenants not get into a big legal battle, and everyone walks away happy. Just one resource I'd like to give you guys, because this website that we created years and years ago, it's an older website, but there's a lot of useful things on it. One, there's a list of therapists in every state, maybe not every city, but if you go to the homepage of hoardingcleanup.com, click on the National Resources tab, it'll bring up a map of the US, click on your state, and you can find resources in your state. It also has a free online support group. Sundays and Tuesday nights, you can log in. It's 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. It's a peer-to-peer group, so there are no doctors, cleaning experts. It's a place for them to be able to talk openly with people that understand and people that are in different, different parts of their own recovery and managing with their own hoarding behaviors, so they can get advice and help. It's completely anonymous, so they can't see or hear each other. They just type back and forth. You can log in with any name you want. No one will know any different. You can be Lisa, Bob, Frank. So there's also message boards. So it's really just an interactive place for people that suffer from this to go, or even you guys to go and look for some answers and some resources. And my email's there if you guys have any questions.
Just an incredible lineup and expert advice from every one of you. I just cannot thank you enough. I was telling them when we were in our practice session that this is very near and dear to my heart. Coming up with this webinar and then having these experts really give such thoughtful and insightful information that is factual, fact-based, and also has an emotional component to it. I just can't thank you enough. We do have a number of questions in the chat box. I know that some of you are on some tight schedules. Do you have 5 minutes that I could call a couple of these out? Okay, fantastic. So I think that many of the experts on here have given you in the presentation their contact information. James is also going to be telling us how we can access the recording to this webinar after it's all said and done. You're going to be able to find that at naahq.org a few days from now. So he will mention that at the end. But one of the questions was sharing that contact information, which we've done in the slides. And then someone asked if there's educational material to share with residents. I guess my thought on that was that usually these are very individualistic situations per person, and that the community manager or property manager becomes aware of a situation, and then that resident has to admit that they have a problem before we can ever get any help for that person. I think just posting on social media may not be the best thing to do, but I'd like for maybe Chris to weigh in on that.
Resources for tenants. I'm probably not best equipped to speak to the resources that could for help, like psychiatric, psychological help with their disorder. There is some stuff out there under joint task forces in certain areas. Of course, the website Corey shared as well. And, there is information out there on their rights to a reasonable accommodation, typically not discussing hoarding, but that should be available out there.
I can also add that the International OCD Foundation has a special section on its website on hoarding disorder. It's an organization whose members are people with lived experience with hoarding, with their family members and friends, as well as professionals dealing with this. And there you'll find a pretty comprehensive resource for therapists across the country and in several other countries as well, who have experience in treating hoarding disorder. So it's a great resource, and the conferences are great conferences for people with lived experience with hoarding and their families. So it would be a great resource for clients that you have, for tenants that you have, to get engaged with this community of people who are eager to help.
Okay, thank you so much. Someone else asked, how do we broach the subject and bringing in an outside service if they're available? And I think that's along the same lines as that other question. But I think that what I heard you all say is if you're running into a situation that you think could be hoarding, you should look at your local and state laws as well as your local attorney and discuss that with them before you broach that subject. Is that correct?
Definitely.
Okay, perfect. And then we have someone else that purchased a triplex in Tacoma. Sounds like they think they've got some hoarding going on. They've given the middle tenant an eviction notice, but they're not moving. I think that the answer to that is they need to get an attorney involved in that situation. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, super. And then is there anything to address organized hoarding when they have so much stuff, but to them, it's organized neatly?
Doesn't matter how neat it is. Hoarding is hoarding. If it affects the functionality of the apartment, becomes a danger to the other tenants because of the weight, because of the fire load, because of all those things, it's still hoarding. Whether it's neat or not, it's an issue.
That's what I was thinking, Corey, because when you were explaining earlier about the weight on that particular unit and how many square feet the load can handle, that's a very dangerous thing. Another question is, can they be charged for the cleanup?
I mean, that's going to depend on the lease and local law. I'm wondering if a factor there might also be whether federal funding's involved, in which case sometimes providers, as you know, have more obligations there. It really depends the context under which the cleanup happens. You've evicted them, you've left, now you have to clean it up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you're going to have security deposits. And of course, there are legal options usually if damage goes beyond what's available from the security deposit. Earlier than that, then it's going to be a very individual situation.
I think local hoarding task forces may be able to provide some help. I know the local one that I'm involved with has frequently been able to come up with funds to help support these kinds of interventions.
Yep. That's a great point. And so when folks are Googling in their local area, they should probably be Googling local hoarding joint task force in order to get that information. Many people have asked for links to resources. Those are going to be provided in the deck that you've just seen. This entire recording, along with all the slides, will come to you. I'm going to turn it over to James here in just a moment, unless anybody else has any questions that they want to pose in the chat box. I think that this has been a phenomenal presentation. I cannot thank you all enough, and I'm going to turn it over to James Campbell with NAA.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thanks once more to all of our presenters for this outstanding webinar. For additional resources, NAA maintains an online portal for its many offerings in industry operations and compliance for the rental housing industry. The URL is featured below, and you might want to especially note our mental health resources, including a groundbreaking mental health survey that is literally open now and ready to accept participation. As Wendy and all mentioned, this webinar will be recorded. It'll be posted on NAA's YouTube channel, and the URL for that is below. So again, I want to thank everyone for participating. A special thanks to our host, Wendy, and to our three presenters rather, Corey, Randy, and Christopher. Many thanks. Thank you as well to our audience. We value your membership and appreciate your attendance. Have a great afternoon.